Almost spilled water on my laptop. That would have been the death of everything. I promise you guys, this video is not going to be fragmented like my last one. That was a special circumstance. And this will be all in one go. So, let go. There we go. Okay, so we have a book here, and I have my suspicions as to which book it is that I wrapped. So, here's what it looks like. It's flat, it's got musical note paper on it. Okay. It's definitely one of the American Girl books, which is what I suspicioned. Okay. It's Addie Surprise. I was kind of suspecting it was this one. Yeah, so we're going to be dramatic reading this one, and it's back to getting illustrations, because this is a kid's book, and kids' books have illustrations. Thank you. Addie's Surprise, A Christmas Story, 1864. By Connie Porter. Illustrations by Melody Rye, Rose Sales, Vigets, Renee Graf, Jane S. Varda. Chapter 1. The Winds of Winter. Addie Walker knew that winter had come to Philadelphia even before she opened her eyes. An icy wind whistled through the crack in the garret window. Mama had just gotten up, letting a puff of cold air in the bed when she lifted the heavy quilt. But her place was still warm, so Addie snuggled into it. Mama's gentle voice called to her. "Addie, honey, I need your help over here. Snow's coming right in through the window." Addie peeked out from under the quilt. In the dim gray light of the morning, she saw Mama straining to close the window. Its panes were white with frost. A pile of snow had built up on the windowsill, and more snow had blown across the floor. "I'm coming, Mama," she said. Addie crawled out of bed and shivered over the window to help Mama. Together they pulled down the window, struggling to close it, but the window wouldn't budge. "Go get them rags next to the stove," Mama said. Addie got the rags and returned to Mama. "Help me stuff these in the crack, Addie," said Mama, as she poked the rags between the window and the sill. "Stuff them good. They all we need to keep the wind from coming in." Addie put one cold foot on top of the other to try to warm up her feet. "Can't we light the stove this morning, Mama?" she asked. "It's so cold in here." "No, honey," Mama said. "We got just enough coal to last us the week if we use it only for cooking supper." She smiled at Addie and gave her a quick, warm hug. "Now you wash up and get ready for school. And hustle, you hear? You hear? Then you won't feel the cold so bad." Addie splashed icy cold water from the basin over her face and dressed quickly. Dancing around in her stocking feet, She waited to pull on her boots until the very end. They were still wet from the puddle she stepped in on her way home from school yesterday, though she had set them by the stove last night. The fire hadn't been warm long enough to dry them out. Addie wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and sat down at the table to eat the cornbread Mama had set out for her. She crumbled it in a bowl and poured buttermilk over it. As she ate, she spied a pile of fabric folded neatly on Mama's chair, with a spool of thread and a pair of scissors on top. "You was up late again sewing, wasn't you, Mama?" asked Addie. "I got to finish this dress for Mrs. Hallowell," answered Mama. "Mrs. Ford say Mrs. Howell is real particular." Mama unfolded the fabric and squinted at one of the seams she had sewn last night. "It's hard to see my stitches by candlelight. We sure do need a lamp." "How much we got saved for it?" asked Addie. Can I count up the money in the milk bottle again?" Mama nodded. "Sure you can," she said, "but I ain't put nothing in since you counted it last week." "I put my tips in last Saturday, Mama," Addie said proudly. "I got 2 big tips when I delivered them dresses to Society Hill for Mrs. Ford." "That's good, Addie," said Mama. She reached into their hiding place behind the stove, picked up the milk bottle, and handed it to Addie. Addie turned the bottle upside down and shook it so that the coins poured out. Then she carefully counted the pennies, half-dimes, and dimes. "We got $1.57, announced Addie. "Well, that ain't enough for a lamp," said Mama. "Guess we gonna have to wait a little longer. Just hope I don't have to pull them stitches out of one of them seams in that dress." Addie finished her breakfast and washed her bowl and spoon in a bucket of water that stood by the stove. Then she sat down so Mama could brush and braid her hair. She looked at the thick folds of green and the red plaid taffeta that lay over the chair next to her. Them rich girls sure got pretty dresses," said Addie. "Sure do," said Mama. "Isabel Hallowell's gonna wear that one to some fancy Christmas party." "Remember last Christmas, Mama?" asked Addie. She thought back to last year when she and Mama were on the plantation with Papa, her brother Sam, and her baby sister Esther. Master Stevens gave us a real skinny chicken. Sam wouldn't even eat it after you cooked it. He was mad because of how hard we worked. He said one chicken couldn't make up for a whole year of work, but I was hungry, and I ate it." "I remember," Mama said. "But Sam ate my sweet potato pudding. He liked that." "And Papa did too," Addie said. "Sweet potato pudding was Papa's favorite. He always said so. He always—" Addie stopped. She and Mama did not even know where Papa and Sam were, and they had to leave baby Esther behind when they ran away from the plantation. She missed Papa and Sam and Esther so much. Mama seemed to know just what Addie was feeling. As she started to braid Addie's hair, she said, "I'm going to make that pudding for Christmas again this year. We'll take it to the church dinner. Auntie Lula taught me to make it. I'm sure she going to be making it this year, too. So when we have Christmas dinner, we'll be eating the same thing as Auntie Lula, Uncle Solomon, and Esther." "I wonder what Esther's Christmas is going to be like," worried Addie. "Well, Auntie Lula and Uncle Solomon ain't going to have to work on Christmas, so they can be with her all day long," said Mama. She finished at Addie's first braid and started on the second one. "And you left your doll Laney with her. That's like Esther having a present to play with every day." "Last night I dreamed we was all together. Sam, Papa, Esther, all of us, here in Philadelphia," said Addie. She turned her head to look at Mama, who looked sad. Mama gently turned Addie's head back and continued braiding. "It ain't gonna be just a dream, Mama. It ain't just gonna be a dream, Mama. It's really gonna happen someday, ain't it?" Addie asked hopefully. "Ain't we all gonna be together someday?" "Someday, honey. Someday. That dream keep me going. That and your bright face." Mama finished the second braid and leaned over to kiss the top of Addie's head. On the way to school that morning, Addie asked her friend Sarah what Christmas was like in Freedom. Sarah described the celebration at church. "I hope it's going to be like last year," said Sarah. "The altar was all decorated with pine branches. In the middle was a manger with baby Jesus, and Mary and Joseph kneeling next to it. There was 3 wise men and a bunch of angels, and even a silvery star hanging from the ceiling. Lots of candles was on the altar. The whole church was glowing and beautiful. I'm telling you, Addie, it's the prettiest thing you'll ever see. Ever." Addie could barely imagine something so lovely. Sarah went on. "After the service, we go downstairs for a big Christmas dinner. Everybody bring something to share, and everyone in the whole church sit down like one great big family. Mama said we was gonna bring sweet potato pudding, just like we had last year for Christmas," said Addie. That sounds good," said Sarah brightly. "But I ain't told you the best part yet, Addie. After dinner, there's a special shadow play for children." "What's that?" asked Addie. "Well, it's kind of hard to describe," said Sarah. "We sit in a dark room that has this big sheet hanging in the front. Behind it, there's this bright lamp. People in front of the lamp make shadows on the sheet. They act out the Christmas story while it's read aloud. I bet it's real nice," Addie said. You gonna love it," Sarah said excitedly. And this year my mama's letting me sing in the children's choir. You should join too. We'll practice every Saturday till Christmas." "I wish I could, but I can't," said Addie. "Saturday is when I work for Mrs. Ford. I'm doing errands and deliveries so she and Mama can spend all their time sewing Christmas dresses for the customers. Mrs. Ford let me keep the tips from the deliveries. I had to promise I would keep up with my lessons." "What are you going to do with your money?" asked Sarah. "Mama and me are saving up for a lamp," answered Addie. "Maybe by the time I finish all the Christmas deliveries, we might have enough saved up." "Well, don't worry, Addie," said Sarah kindly. "If you can't come to choir practice, I'll teach you the songs. Then you can sing on Christmas along with everyone else." "I'd like that," said Addie. She smiled at her friend. "We can start right now," said Sarah. "The first song we always sing is Joy to the World. Here's how it goes." With that, Sarah began to sing. Addie listened and then hummed along. Soon she knew the words. "Joy to the world." The two girls sang together as they hurried through the winter streets to school. Chapter 2. Something Pretty. Early on Saturday morning, Addie set out on her errands and deliveries for Mrs. Ford. She brought a bill to a customer on Society Hill. Then she went to the dry goods store a few blocks away and picked up supplies that Mrs. Ford had ordered. The thread, buttons, ribbon, and fringe were wrapped into one parcel before Addie left the store. Addie held on to the parcel tightly as she stepped around the slush and dirty puddles in the streets. On the way to her next stop, she passed the windows of Mr. Del Monte's second-hand shop. Sometimes she and Mama went there to look for clothes or pots and pans. The socks Addie had on today had come from Mr. Del Monte's. There was a small darn in the heel of one sock, but the other was as good as new. Addie stopped for a minute to look in the window. Lying among the used shoes, wool caps, and old belts was a bright patch of red cloth. It looked like the corner of a scarf, but most of it was hidden behind a rusty tea kettle. Addie went inside to take a closer look. Mr. Del Monte recognized her right away. "Good morning, Addie," he said in his jolly way. "What brings you here today?" Can I see that red scarf in the window?" Addie asked. Mr. Del Monte reached into the window display and moved the tea kettle so he could lift out the scarf and hand it to Addie. "It's a beauty," he said. "Hardly looks worn." Addie unfolded the scarf. It was like new. The red fabric was soft and smooth. Addie held it up to her cheek. Right then she knew she wanted Mama to have this scarf. "Mama should have something pretty like this," thought Addie. "She works so hard. She'd look so beautiful in this when we go to the Christmas service at church." Addie was almost afraid to ask about the price. She looked up at Mr. Del Monte. "How much it cost?" she asked. 20 cents, answered Mr. Del Monte. "It's a good price for something that looks like it's never been worn." Addie was discouraged. She didn't have 20 cents. But she had to buy that scarf somehow. "Please, Mr. Del Monte," she said, "could you put it away from me? I'm going to try my best to get the money and to buy it." "Well, I'll put it behind that rusty kettle again," answered Mr. Del Monte. You're the only person who's spotted it since I put it in the window last week. It'll probably stay there a little longer." "Hope so," said Addie, as she carefully folded the scarf and handed it back to Mr. Del Monte. The feel of the soft material and its bright red color stayed in Addie's mind as she headed back to Mrs. Ford's shop. "How am I going to get 20 cents? she wondered. Back at the shop, Mrs. Ford had 3 packages for her to deliver, all wrapped in brown paper. "These go to Society Hill," said Mrs. Ford as she handed them to Addie. "Be careful. Don't splash mud on them." "Yes, ma'am," said Addie. The streets were busier that afternoon than they were in the morning. Addie had to dodge around throngs of people bustling in and out of shops. Her packages were clumsy, and she worried about dropping them on the soppy sidewalk. After Mama had worked so hard, Addie wanted to make sure the dresses were delivered in perfect condition. The last delivery was on Spruce Street. As Addie walked toward the address, she saw an old man lighting the street lamps. The lamps cast a golden glow on the wet sidewalks. When Addie got to the house, she rang the bell and waited for the big door to open. A maid finally came, and Addie handed her the bundle. This is from Mrs. Ford's shop," she said proudly. The maid took the package and handed Addie 5 pennies. Addie thanked her and turned away. As she walked back down Spruce Street, she curled her fingers around the coins inside her mitten. Suddenly, Addie had an idea. She decided to stop by Mr. Del Monte's shop again on the way home, just to be sure the soft red scarf was still there. As she approached the store, Mr. Del Monte was just locking up. "Don't worry, Addie," he said. "The scarf is still here. I moved it off in the corner a bit, but you can see it if you know where to look." The two of them stood at the window together. Mr. Del Monte headed down the street, but Addie stayed at the window, thinking about her idea. "If I put half my tips in the milk bottle," she thought, "and keep the other half, maybe I can save enough money to buy the scarf for Mama." Addie lingered a little longer, staring at the scarf in the faded light, thinking how pretty Mama would look in it. Then she headed back to Mrs. Ford's shop. By the time she got to the shop, her feet were numb with cold and her nose felt frozen. "You look frozen stiff, child," said Mrs. Ford, peering above her spectacles. Mrs. Ford had a tape measure draped around her neck, and Mama had ribbon thrown across one shoulder, and as she sewed fringe on the edge of a sash. They looked busy, and Addie knew she shouldn't bother them. "Mama, can I light the stove upstairs now?" Addie asked Addie. "Please?" "No, Addie," Mama answered. "You know we don't light the stove until I start cooking supper. You head on upstairs. I'll be up as soon as I finish this." "Yes, Mama," said Addie. As she headed out the door, she heard Mrs. Ford ask Mama, "How is everything up in the garret?" "Everything's fine," Mama answered quickly. "We get by." Addie wanted to turn around and tell Mrs. Ford the truth, that it was freezing in the garret and dark and sometimes very lonely. On the plantation, Addie had been allowed to spend more time with Mama than she was here. She wanted to tell Mrs. Ford about the broken window and the snow on the floor, but Addie knew Mama would not want her to complain. "We get by," Addie said softly to herself as she climbed the stairs. When she got to the top, she lit the candle on the table and turned her mitten inside out and let her tip money fall onto the table. She brought the milk bottle out from behind the stove and set it next to the money. Then Addie went over to the bed and lifted up a corner of her mattress. There she found the kerchief that she had brought from the plantation when she and Mama had escaped from slavery. Tied in the corner was the half-dime Uncle Solomon had given her. It was the only money they had when they headed north for freedom. "Freedom's got a cost," Uncle Solomon had said when he gave it to Addie. She had saved it for something very special, something important. Addie brought the kerchief over to the table and divided her tip money into 2 piles. She dropped one pile into the milk bottle and carefully tied the other coins into the corner of her kerchief. With Uncle Solomon's half-dime, and she had 10 cents in the kerchief. That was half of what she needed. Mama's red scarf. "I'm halfway there," Addie thought to herself. The thought made her so happy she didn't think about the cold. Chapter 3. Freedom Ain't Free. At church the next morning, Mama and Addie sat side by side in the women's section. Addie looked across the aisle where all the men sat and imagined that someday her papa would be sitting over there and smiling and giving her a wink that said, "You my favorite girl." When the deep notes of the organ sounded, everyone stood to sing. The first song was one of Addie's favorites. Auntie Lula had taught it to her back on the plantation. Now, Addie sang out with the others in joy. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine." After a long prayer, Reverend Drake began his sermon. "I want to begin this morning by reading from the book of Luke. Turn to chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. Mama took a Bible from the rack on the pew in front of them. Addie helped her find the passage. Reverend Drake said, This passage I'm about to read to you is about Mary and Joseph." Addie and Mama and the other members followed along as Reverend Drake read. "And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Now this is the story of Christmas, the story of the birth of Jesus. The time had come for Mary to give birth to Jesus. Let me tell you people, time is a curious thing. It can't be stopped like a clock, Reverend Drake said. "You're right, Reverend," one church member called out. "Time keeps right on moving, and I'm here to tell you the time for freedom has come for thousands of our people. These freed men are waiting right now in Washington, D.C. and other cities, and they need our help. Stay with me now," Reverend Drake preached. Think with me, because I'm here to tell you this morning, freedom ain't free." A church member shouted back, "You preaching the truth!" Addie scooted over closer to Mama and laid her head on Mama's shoulder. Mama put her arm around Addie and rocked gently on the pew. Addie liked coming to church. Anyone who wanted to could take part in the service. If you felt like answering the Reverend, you could. if you felt like crying or laughing or clapping to the music the choir sang, you could. Reverend Drake continued, "Some of you already know what I'm talking about, because there was a time when you came to freedom and you found out what freedom was about. It wasn't free. You needed food to eat, clothes to wear, a place to stay." "Amen," Mama replied. "I'm here to tell you people time ain't gonna stop for those thousands of freedmen who need our help. As I speak to you, babies are being born, and children are hungry, and mothers and fathers have no place to lay their heads at night. They need our help now. Today." Reverend Drake said, his voice getting louder. Addie looked up at Mama and saw tears running down her face. Addie gave Mama a little hug. "As we enter the season of Advent, the time of preparing for Christmas, let God work through you. When the collection boxes are passed this morning, remember to put in a little extra for our Freedmen's Fund. These people are your cousins, your brothers and sisters, your mothers and fathers," Reverend Drake said, pounding on the pulpit. "It might mean you have to sacrifice. If you can't give of your money, give of your time. Next Saturday, a group of freedmen are coming in at the pier. Come help us welcome them to freedom. I close by saying, freedom can be a lonely walk through the wilderness and dark, but you can make a difference between a lonely night and one filled with light and hope." On the way home from church, Mama and Addie walked hand in hand, humming "This Little Light of Mine." Even though it was cold out, Addie felt a warm glow inside. "I've been thinking about what Reverend Drake said this morning," said Mama slowly. "He made me remember how it was for you and me when we first came to Philadelphia. We had nothing. The church helped us when we needed it. Now we done saved more than $1.50. The freemen need our help right now. They need our savings more than we do. We can get along without a lamp, but they can't get along without help. What do you think?" At first, Addie did not want to say anything. It was true. She and Mama could get along without the lamp, but they had saved so hard for it. A lamp would help her see better when she did her homework, and it would help Mama when she had to sew late at night. Addie could imagine how nice it would be to have a lamp when Sam and Papa and Esther returned, when their family was at last together again. She could picture their faces glowing in the bright light as they gathered around the dinner table. But then she remembered how scared and lonely she and Mama had been when they first came to Philadelphia, and how the church had helped them find work, a place to live, and friends. "I think we should give our money to the church," Addie said. "Other people helped us. The money might even help Sam or Papa or Esther come to us." "Even if it don't," replied Mama, "it's going to help somebody. That's what's important." She squeezed Addie's hand. We'll give the church our money next Sunday." With a pang of guilt, Addie remembered the 10 cents she had knotted up in her kerchief. Should she give that to help Freedom too? No, thought Addie. I can't give that money away. It's for Mama's Christmas present. Addie decided to keep the money as was determined. She was determined to buy the scarf and show Mama how much she loved her. She would find another way to help the freedmen. "Mama," she asked, "can I go to the pier next Saturday to help out with the freedmen?" "I think that would be fine, Addie," said Mama. "So just so you finish all of Mrs. Ford's deliveries." "I will, Mama," Addie promised. Chapter 4. The Cost of Freedom. When Addie arrived at the pier the next Saturday, Reverend Drake was already handing out old clothes and blankets to the people who had just gotten off the boat. Sarah and her mother were there, just as they had been when Addie and Mama arrived in Philadelphia last summer. Addie was glad to see them. "What am I supposed to say to these folks?" Addie asked Sarah. "You ain't got to say nothing special," Sarah said. "Just be yourself." "I wish I could be like you," Addie said. "When you met us, you made us feel like I was coming home. You made me feel like I was coming home." "I was scared the day I met you," Sarah admitted. And look how good things turned out for us." The pier was slick with mud. Garbage floated in the dark, icy water, and newly freed people huddled together in silent groups. They looked cold, frightened, hungry, and lost. Addie closed her eyes. For a second, Esther, Sam, Papa, be here, Addie wished. But when she opened her eyes, there were no familiar faces in the crowd. Addie's heart sank. Just then, she saw a thin woman who held a bundle in her arms. Addie heard a sharp cry. For a second, Addie thought it was Esther crying, and her heart started to pound. Then she saw a little hand reach up from the bundle. Quickly, Addie pulled her shawl from around her shoulders and handed it to the woman, who thanked her and wrapped the shawl around her baby. Addie held out her arms. "Can I carry the baby?" I can carry the baby if you like," she said. "I'll be careful." The woman smiled weakly. "Thank you kindly," she said. She handed the baby to Addie. Addie cradled the baby in her arms, just as she used to cradle Esther. The baby's eyes were bright as buttons. Addie held the baby close to her chest, hoping to warm her. The baby waved her arms and grabbed the cowrie shell necklace Addie wore around her neck. The baby's mother smiled. "She like you," she said. "She don't take a shine to just anyone." The woman rode back to the church, and in the wagon that Reverend Drake had brought along with an old man who was coughing so hard his whole body shook. Another man in the wagon had been limping along with a stick he used as a crutch. His foot was bandaged with dirty rags. Addie looked at the poor, tired people who plodded along behind the wagon. Some had no shoes, others wore tattered clothes. Addie held the baby closer, trying to keep her warm. "Where are y'all from?" Addie asked the baby's mother. "We're coming up from Baltimore," said the woman. "All the slaves on our plantation was turned out about a month ago. We was told we was free and we had to get. But we ain't had nowhere to go. No food, no nothing. Me and some others walked together for a week. We ate almost nothing but grass. We walked until we got to Baltimore." "Things gonna be better here," promised Addie. "The people at the church helped me and my mama. They'll help you, too." When the wagon arrived back at the church, Addie led the women to the fellowship hall in the basement. The big room was warm and dry and filled with smells of delicious food. Many church members were there to help serve food to the freedmen. Addie remembered how she and Mama had been in the same place eating their first warm meal in freedom on their first day in Philadelphia. She had said, "People in the church gonna be your family." Addie hugged the baby one last time. Memories of Esther filled her mind, and she squeezed her eyes tight to stop the tears. Then Addie left to go to Mrs. Ford's. Back at the shop, there were more errands to do and 3 deliveries to make. Addie hurried along the busy streets. She saw women in fancy hats and fur coats carrying packages wrapped in bright paper. Usually Addie would have been fascinated with their fine clothes and fancy manners, but today they seemed silly. She remembered the people shivering at the pier. A man in a top hat strolled by, swinging a fine walking stick. Addie thought of the man at the pier with his foot in dirty bandages. When Addie made a delivery to one of the biggest houses on Society Hill, all she could think of were the freedmen who had arrived that morning. None of them had places to stay. Addie got tips from the first 2 houses she went to. The coins jiggled in her mitten, and she began to think cheerfully about the scarf that she would be able to buy for Mama. If she got a 5-cent tip from her last delivery, she would have just enough for the scarf. Addie began to walk faster. Her last delivery was the beautiful plaid dress for Isabella Hallowell. It was the dress Mama had worked hardest on, and Addie was very proud to be delivering it. She lifted the shiny brass knocker on the front door and banged it loudly 3 times. Soon a woman came in. "Who are you?" she asked coldly. "I'm Addie Walker. This here is a dress from Mrs. Ford's dress shop. It's for Isabella Hallowell." "Very well, then," said the maid as she took the package. "Wait here." Addie stood in the entrance of the Hallowell's mansion. The house looked more beautiful than any house she'd ever seen. The staircase was dark wood, curved up to the 2nd floor. Addie could see into the living room too. She saw a high-backed pink couch and pink chairs, Instead of kerosene lamps, the room had gas lamps, each one lighted and covered by a glass globe. In the corner, a decorated Christmas tree reached up to the ceiling. The lamplight lifted the room with a rosy glow, and a fire burned in the hearth. The maid returned shortly and pressed a coin into Addie's hand. "Here's a tip for you, child. Now run along," she said, hurrying Addie out the door. Addie was outside. The big door had closed behind her. Before she looked at the coin in her hand, she couldn't believe what she saw. "A dime!" said Addie out loud. "A whole dime!" It was the biggest tip Addie had ever gotten. She slid it into her mitten. Now she had enough for Mama's scarf. She even had a little extra to put in the milk bottle to start saving for the lamp again. Addie skipped down the walk and ran all the way back to the shop. She didn't even stop to see Mama and Mrs. Ford. Instead, she ran upstairs and took her kerchief out from under the mattress and untied the knot and let the coins fall on the table. She turned her mitten upside down and dumped the tips she had made that day into the pile of money. Carefully, she counted 20 cents for Mama's scarf. Then she dropped the rest of the money into the milk bottle. The 20 cents went into her mitten. She would get the scarf this afternoon after she finished her errands. She could hardly wait. Addie's last chore of the day was to get Mrs. Ford's scissors sharpened. The sharpener's shop was not too far from Mr. Del Monte's shop. If Addie hurried, she could get the scissors sharpened and buy the scarf before it got dark. The grinding wheel that sharpened the scissors made a loud whining noise, so Addie waited outside. People pushed her in a hurry to get home. Streetcars clanged and carriages rushed by. But she hardly noticed them. All she could think about was Mama's beautiful scarf and how surprised she would be on Christmas morning. A woman pushing a fancy baby buggy wheeled toward Addie and stopped in front of the shop. The buggy was too big to fit through the door. So the woman parked it next to Addie and lifted out a little baby all bundled in soft fleecy blankets. The baby started to fuss. Suddenly, Addie remembered the baby she'd held that morning. Then she began to think about Esther. My sister might not be as lucky as that baby at the pier. Who's going to give money for her to come to freedom? Addie felt the coins she held in her hand inside the mitten. It was only 20 cents. But if everyone gave as much as possible, then all the newly freed people could get to the north, maybe even Esther. Addie stood quietly by herself for a minute. Her heart ached with the memory of her baby sister. Then she turned and went inside to pick up the scissors. Addie headed toward Mr. Del Monte's store. It was still open. She could see the pretty red scarf tucked behind the tea kettle in the window. But Addie didn't go inside. Instead, she walked down the street a few more blocks until she came to the church. With both hands, she pulled open the heavy door. She slowly walked over to the box at the side of the church. Above it was a sign that said, Freedmen's Fund. Slowly, Addie took off her mitten. One by one, she dropped her coins into the box. The last coin was the half-dime Uncle Solomon had given her. She remembered the words he said to her, "Freedom's got a cost." Then she thought of Esther, Sam, and Papa, still waiting to take their freedom. And she let the half-dime clink to the box with the rest of her money. When Addie got back to the shop, she could see Mama and Mrs. Ford through the window. They were sitting next to the stove with their heads bent over their sewing. Addie knew they were working on the last 2 dresses that had to be done before Christmas. Both women looked up when Addie came through the door. "There won't be any more deliveries today," said Mrs. Ford. "You run along now, Addie," said Mama. "I'll be up soon to start supper." As Addie turned to leave, Mrs. Ford spoke again. "There's no sense in you going upstairs. Stay here with me and your mother." Addie turned around and looked at Mrs. Ford, and then at Mama. She could not believe her ears. Did Mrs. Ford say she could stay in the shop? Mama said, "Addie will be all right upstairs." Mrs. Ford, "I know you're running a business here, and you don't want children in the shop." "I know I've said that in the past," Mrs. Ford said to Mama, "but I believe that Addie has served my business well, and I don't think she'll be in the way." Addie stood at the door with her back against the knob. She looked at Mama, who looked puzzled. And Addie was puzzled too. She had no idea what Mrs. Ford was up to. "Take this," Mrs. Ford said to Addie. She handed a needle book with 2 shiny needles inside. "While your mother and I work here, you can keep yourself busy. I know your mother taught you how to make a hem. Here is a plain apron you can practice on." "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Ford," Addie said. "There's no need to thank me," Mrs. Ford said, as she went back to her sewing. "Come sit on this crate with me," Mama said. "I'll keep an eye on your stitches." Addie sat down next to Mama and spread the white apron across her lap. She smoothed it out and the threaded the needle and knotted it tight. She picked up the corner of the apron and started to sew the hem, carefully and slowly. Addie went about her task. She concentrated hard on her stitches, making them even and straight. Addie was glad to have a job to do. It helped her get her mind off of the scarf. But more than anything, she was glad to be with Mama. Chapter 5. Christmas Surprises. From that day on, Addie was allowed to spend her afternoons sewing in the warm shop with Mama and Mrs. Ford, instead of in the cold garret by herself. Business had begun to slow down. Mama and Mrs. Ford were just finishing up a few small items. 4 days before Christmas, Addie was straightening up the shop for Mrs. Ford. She loved to sort the buttons into boxes, arrange the feathers, organize or according to size, and straightening the creamy laces and the loopy fringes. She carefully wound the ribbons back on their spools and organized the thread by color. She folded the beautiful fabrics and piled them neatly on the shelf. By the end of the afternoon, all that was left to do was to pick up the pins that had fallen on the floor in the Christmas bustle. Addie was on her hands and knees filling the pin box when the door burst open and in stormed an angry woman. Right behind her was a tall, plump girl. Addie knew the woman must be Mrs. Hallowell because she carried the beautiful green plaid dress that Mama had worked so hard on. She thrust it toward Mrs. Ford. "Look at this dress!" she fumed. "Just look at it!" Mrs. Ford took the dress and held it in front of her. The seams on the sides were split open, and the threads of the plaid dress were frayed. The buttons on the back had popped off. The dress looked wrinkled and droopy, as if someone had tossed it in a heap on the floor. "This dress was made too small!" Mrs. Hallowell raged. "I've never seen such poor work!" Addie looked at Mama, who kept her eyes on the sewing in her lap. Addie could see Mama's lips tightening in anger. "Right there," Mrs. Ford said firmly. "Ruth Walker here is the best seamstress I've ever had working for me. I am sure the dress was not made too small. It was sewn to the exact measurements we took at the fitting last month. Perhaps Isabella has grown some." Addie looked at Isabella. She stood near the door, looking at her feet, her round face flushed pink. Mrs. Ford went on. "If you are unhappy, Mrs. Hallowell, I will give you a full refund. Not because the dress was poorly made, but because you are dissatisfied. Mrs. Ford opened the drawer where she kept the money. She reached inside and took out a handful of bills, which she quickly counted into Mrs. Hallowell's hand. "Now, good day to you, madam," Mrs. Ford said coldly, as she pushed the drawer shut with a bang. "Good day!" said Mrs. Hallowell. A blast of cold air blew in the shop as she slammed the door behind them. Mrs. Ford sat back down. As she picked up her sewing, she said, "I can't believe she acted that way. Some people have no idea what the Christmas season is all about." As Christmas approached, almost no one came into the shop. All the dresses had been finished. Addie made her last delivery on the day before Christmas, taking a red hat to a lady on Society Hill. When she returned to the shop in the early afternoon, Mama wasn't there. "She's gone upstairs for a rest. Your mother's worked hard," said Mrs. Ford. "I plan to close the shop early this afternoon and take a rest myself." Addie started to head upstairs, but Mrs. Ford stopped her. "Before you go, Addie, I have one last package." She handed a parcel wrapped in brown paper to Addie. "Who's it for?" Addie asked. "Open it," said Mrs. Ford. "It's for you." Addie untied the package and could hardly believe believe what was inside. The green plaid dress Mama had made for Isabel Hallowell, but it looked like new. All the seams were repaired and the buttons had been replaced. "I want you to have this dress, Addie," said Mrs. Ford. "You've been such a big help to your mother and me this Christmas season. You have worked hard. I've made this dress smaller to fit you. The hem just needs to be cut to the right length. Slip the dress on now and I'll pin it right up before I leave." Addie didn't know what to say. She stared at the dress. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Addie stood on a crate while Mrs. Ford kneeled on the floor, measuring the hem and putting pins at the right length. Addie turned in a circle, taking tiny steps as the skirt of the dress was marked to the proper length. Then she took off the dress so Mrs. Ford could cut off the extra material. When Mrs. Ford was finished, the long, wide piece of material she had cut from the bottom of the dress, was hanging around her neck. Seeing it gave Addie an idea. "Mrs. Ford, can I have that material that you cut off the dress?" asked Addie. "Certainly, Addie," replied Mrs. Ford. "All of this dress belongs to you. Now sit right down here and sew the hem. You know how to do that. I'll be leaving now, but you can stay down here where the light is better and let your mother rest. When you're through, don't forget to put out the lamp." "Yes, ma'am," said Addie. "And thank you, Mrs. Ford. Thank you for such a beautiful dress." "You're welcome, Addie," said Mrs. Ford. "Merry Christmas." On Christmas morning, the sun shone brightly. Addie and Mama woke early, excited to spend their first Christmas in freedom. Mama spoke first. I know you awake, Bright Eyes," she said. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Mama," Addie said, sitting up in bed, sun streaming in the window, and the frosty panes looked as though they were covered with a delicate lace. "I got a surprise for you, honey," said Mama. She handed a small parcel wrapped in paper. "I got one for you too, Mama," said Addie excitedly. "You open yours first," laughed Mama. So Addie untied the string. As the paper fell away, she saw a little rag doll with a bright red smile stitched on her face. She had a bow tucked in her hair, tiny hoop earrings, and a purple dress. Addie beamed with joy. "Mama, she's so pretty," she said happily, hugging the doll. "She's just as pretty as Janie was." Mama smiled at Addie. "I stuffed her with some beans I saved." Addie hugged the doll. The beans gave her a nice lumpy plumpness like that Addie liked. "I'll call her Addie Bean," said Addie with a giggle. "Now, Mama, sit down and Now, Mama, sit down and hide your eyes while I get my surprise for you. Don't look, because mine ain't wrapped." Addie hopped out of bed and went across the room to her school satchel. She took out the gift she'd hidden inside. "Are your eyes still closed, Mama?" Addie asked before turning around. "Sure enough," said Mama. Addie ran across the floor and placed her gift in Mama's lap. "Now you can open your eyes," said Addie. When Mama looked down, there was a lovely scarf of beautiful green plaid before her. The edges were sewn with tiny, perfect stitches, and the ends were fringed. "Addie, where did you get this?" asked Mama in surprise. Addie told Mama all about the dress Mrs. Ford had repaired for her, and about the extra material that was left when she cut off the bottom to make the dress fit Addie. "I spent yesterday afternoon hemming the dress and making the extra material into a scarf for you, Mama," Addie explained. "Oh, Addie," said Mama, gently running her hands across the plaid. "It's beautiful. Ain't we gonna look fine going to church this evening?" Mama gave Addie a long hug. "I'm proud of my girl," she said. Ida Bean sat on Addie's lap while she and Mama had breakfast together. Then Addie put on her apron and propped Ida Bean in a chair so she could watch as Addie and Mama made sweet potato pudding. There was some pudding left over, so Mama put it in a small pan. "We can leave this one here and have it tomorrow," Mama said. By the middle of the afternoon there was pudding done. The pudding was done, and its sweet, spicy smell filled the tiny garret. Then Mama and Addie got ready for church. Addie wore her beautiful new dress, and Mama took time braiding and fixing Addie's hair. Mama put her new scarf around her neck and tied it in a big bow. Addie thought Mama had never looked more beautiful. "I'm going to take Ida Bean with me to show Sarah," said Addie, tucking her doll under her arm. Then Addie and Mama headed down the stairs and out to the church. As they got closer to church, the sun was setting. They could hear the organ music. When they opened the big doors to the church and stepped inside, Addie knew that Sarah had been right. The altar did look magical, with the manger scene and the silvery star shining high above. Mama and Addie had just been seated when a loud chorus blasted from the organ, and the choir began to walk down the aisle singing, "Joy to the world," in strong, happy voices. A glow filled the dark church as the choir marched in. Each member held a candle that cast shadows into the church. Addie watched for Sarah, who was in the front of the choir. Sarah turned and smiled at Addie. Addie gave a shy wave back. She felt tears run down her cheeks. She was crying because the church was so beautiful and the choir sounded so good, and she and Mama were together. When the service was over, everyone went down to Fellowship Hall for dinner. There was turkey and dressing, squash and greens, cornbread and applesauce. Addie had never had so much food on her plate at one time. When it was time to go back for dessert, Addie ignored all the cakes and pies and headed straight for Mama's sweet potato pudding in the shining black skillet. As she savored each smooth, sweet bite, she thought about Papa, Sam, and Esther. Maybe next Christmas, she thought, maybe next Christmas we'll all be together eating Mama's sweet potato pudding. After dinner, the adults lingered over their coffee while the children hurried to the room set up for the shadow play. Sarah and Addie sat on a bench next to each other with Ida Bean snuggled between them. When all the children were settled, the door was closed, the lamps on the walls were blown out, and the room was completely dark. The children squealed with excitement and pretended to be scared. After a minute, a lamp began to glow behind the sheet in front of the room. All eyes watched as the first shadow figure appeared on the street, and the Christmas story was read aloud. One figure and then another and another appeared on the sheet, until soon Addie could see the shadow of Mary bent over the manger, holding her newborn baby, with Joseph standing at her side. 3 shepherds stood beside them. A deep, rolling voice continued to read as the children sat in the dark, quietly watching the shapes against the lighted sheet. As the star appeared to guide the wise men, the door at the side of the room opened. A shaft of light from the hall filled the darkened room. The children turned to see who had opened the door. It was a tall man. Though Addie could not see his face, his shadow was a shape she recognized. Addie jumped up and struggled through the rows of children, tripping over their feet, stumbling as she hurried to the door. Addie knew who was standing in the door, standing there right now. Not a dream, not someday, but right now. "Papa!" she burst out. "Papa, is that you?" "Is that my Addie?" came the answer. It was Papa. Addie rushed to him, and he swept her up into his strong arms and held her close for a long time. It was dark by the time Addie, Papa, and Mama headed back to the garret, walking hand in hand through the Christmas streets. When they got to the top of the stairs above Mrs. Ford's shop, Addie could see light under their door. "That's strange," Mama said. We didn't leave the candle burning." When they opened the door, there on the table was a kerosene lamp shining brightly. Addie read the note lying beside it. "May the hope of the Christmas season shine in your lives, always. Merry Christmas from Mrs. Ford," she read. Papa turned away from Addie. "What's wrong, Papa?" she asked. Then she heard him. He was crying. "Don't cry," Addie said. Papa faced Addie and knelt down in front of her. "I'm crying because I'm so happy. I'm so proud you can read," he said. "I always knew you was a smart girl." Addie doing so good in school," Mama said. "She won a prize for spelling." "Mama can read too, and write," said Addie. "I've been helping her, and I can help you." "Come sit at the table, you two," Mama said. "I got something Papa might like." They sat down at the table, and Mama brought the little pan of pudding that they'd set aside that morning. "Sweet potato pudding," Papa explained. "Ruth, it was like you knew I was coming." "We never stopped hoping," Mama said, smiling. Addie picked up Ida Bean and crawled into Papa's lap. Papa ate the pudding while he told Addie and Mama about the time since he was taken from them. "Me and Sam was separated that very next day. I don't know where they took him, but I think it was for the South." "Or maybe he escaped," Addie said hopefully. "Maybe." Papa said, "If there was a way for your brother to run, I know he found it. I couldn't though. I was bound hand and foot all the way to my new plantation. And after all that, all us slaves on the plantation was freed 2 months after I got there." "And then you found your way to Mama and me," Addie said. Then Mama and Addie told Papa about leaving Esther and Auntie Lula and Uncle Solomon and escaping into the woods and onto freedom in Philadelphia. Papa was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "I'm going to try my best to get Esther and Sam back with us so we can all be together right here in Philadelphia like we planned. There was a Freedmen's Society in Maryland that helped me come here to you. Maybe the Freedmen's Society in Philadelphia can help us. Addie laid her head against Papa's chest. She felt certain that their dream would happen. One day, she said, we all gonna be together, all of us, with Esther and Sam too. You tired, Addie? Mama said. It's time you got ready for bed. Can't I stay up longer? Addie asked. I want to sit up all night like a little old... You want to sit up all night like a little old owl? Papa teased. Addie laughed. Yes, Papa, I want to stay up and be with you. Well, I ain't going nowhere. I'm going to be here when you wake up in the morning. Papa said, I'll be the first thing you see when the sun comes in that window. Addie loved that window from the second we moved in here, Mama said. But it got stuck about a month ago, and we can't get it down. Let me have a look, Papa said. He lifted Addie off his lap and went over to the window. Mama and Addie followed him. Papa studied the window and then hit the frame in 2 places. Then he pulled down hard and closed the window. There, said Papa. It needs a new sash. I can make that. But it should be warmer in here now. It already is, said Addie. She and Mama put their arms around Papa in the window. Addie could see their happy faces reflected in the glow of the lamplight. And that was Addie's Surprise. As much as I love the Addie books, when I was a kid, like, she was my second favorite. Like, Molly was obviously my first favorite when I was little, and Addie was like my second favorite. The writing in this book is good. It's a good holiday book, but I don't really like how they kind of just randomly shove in the bit with her dad at the end. Don't get me wrong, I'm super glad she finds her dad, but I just feel like it was kind of like a last minute addition. They were just like, oh, we gotta get them all together by like 6 books, so we're adding this at the end. It just seemed like a last minute thing. I mean, they did have the stuff about like the Freedmen's Society, but it just didn't seem like it had been set up very well. But I do still love this book. It's very Christmassy. I love it. And